Hi everyone, I'm Aaron, and I'm going to be talking about my critical incident, but it's not really a singular critical incident online, but rather a conglomeration of a few different ones. Um, so this is not entirely new to me. I do webinar presentations once every month or so for IELTS. So what I do is I uh, present information about the test, tips and strategies and whatnot for people who are interested in kind of learning about the test before they take it. I do this on a platform called Zoom, which is typically used for video conferencing, but we do use it for online presentations. I usually get about 10 to 60 participants watching these presentations, and they can take part, so they can kind of type messages and stuff like that, but they cannot actually use the video because that would be a bit too distracting, because we do have to get through the presentation in about 90 minutes to 2 hours, but it usually takes a little bit more than 2 hours to actually get through because there's so much to talk about. But because they can't use the video and all of that, because they're using text-based communication, it's kind of, they have no time to really establish an identity. I'm the only one who is seen, so they don't really get a chance to really do that, and there's very limited time for them to engage, and can't really engage with one another. So it's very, very limiting in that way. So they don't really get to, they can ask me questions at times. I do give them the opportunity to do that, and I say, okay, this is the time in which you can ask questions. However, yes, some of them do kind of jump in and ask me irrelevant questions at different times. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a cultural issue. It could possibly be, but I think it's more that some people are just very, very desperate to find out the answers to the questions they want to know. Where culture definitely does play a role is occasionally I get Australians and British people kind of watching these presentations because they may have to take the test themselves, or people whose English is very, very strong. And of course what happens then is they become quite dominant, and the others tend to participate far less once they start to see what these people whose English is quite stronger are capable of doing. And in Gunnar Wardena, Fred Chet and Lions Learner Supports, they do mention that non-participation in groups is sometimes due to reluctance to engage with overbearing online personalities, and so this certainly would apply in that case. It may also be that some people are not so adept at computer equipment and mobile devices, but I think nowadays that's probably not such a major reason for that happening. But I do think that because it is text-based, people whose writing skills might be considered to be weaker may just not have time to type in their messages quite as quickly, or they just might not be very confident with their grammar. So that could also play a role, especially when they see people whose English is much better typing very, very well. I do notice that this is usually males who do this, so that does fit in with the readings. A couple of them mentioned that males are far more likely to kind of be a bit more dominating in their participation online than females are, so there could be an issue there. Or not an issue, but that could explain why that's happening a bit more. Now, there are times where I do ask questions, and some questions will just be basic information about the test itself, like how long is this part of the test, what is this part of the test testing you on, how many questions are there, and whatnot. But occasionally I will ask a question to people watching that requires a bit more in the way of critical thinking skills, especially in preparation for a writing test or something. And that's when things can oftentimes get a bit awkward. Because there's just a dead silence and nobody wants to say anything. And so I'm kind of sitting there waiting for a response and no one is responding. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that learning to argue does represent, this is according to Johansson and Kim in their article, but learning to argue represents an important way of thinking that facilitates conceptual change and is essential for problem solving. Now, if you have not had exposure to that in your education, then me presenting an argument to you could be quite a shock, especially when you have to use type in order to kind of communicate back to me. So I think many people do get quite nervous about that, and so I will say something like, okay, for example, what school uniforms. Some people would think that school uniforms are a good idea. What could be some reasons why people might think that school uniforms are a bad idea, that students should not have to wear school uniforms? And if the people I'm talking to come from places where school uniforms are normal and expected, then that question can, I think, throw some of them off. And so as a result, there's just nothing, nada. And so then, of course, what I have to try and do at that point is I have to try to encourage people to respond by saying, well, there's no right or wrong answer here. Don't worry about being embarrassed. Just give it a try. And oftentimes after I kind of do that, a couple of messages do pop up. But I think the fact that people feel the need that there's pressure put on them to respond immediately does kind of make some people nervous. In addition to the English factor, that their English is probably not top notch, and they might feel there's too much of a room for embarrassment, even though we cannot see what they look like. I think for some people that still is a bit too much pressure. And as far as reader's table goes, the very first thing in that table says communicative style. Are they predisposed to that way of communicating? And for many of them, the fact that there's an argument being presented, which they're not used to having to deal with in their culture, plus the fact that it's being done in English is all too much. And as a result, they just stop typing, and there's just nothing. And so I'm sitting there kind of waiting for participation to come back to me, and nothing does. And so that would be, I guess, my critical incident, if you can call it that, but it's one that I have to deal with quite often. So it certainly fits into a lot of what was mentioned in the readings themselves. So I could certainly relate to a lot of what was mentioned, especially in the article Learner Support. As I was reading through that, I saw a lot of things that I was like, yeah, I can certainly relate. So anyway, thank you all very much. Looking forward to seeing your critical incidents as well. Thank you.